try to make it easy on the editors at Skywatch by not doing that.
All right, so what is spiritual warfare?
Spiritual warfare is really the engagement with the spirit realm, these principalities and powers that the Apostle Paul wrote about. I mean, he made it very clear in Ephesians chapter 6. That's the letter that he wrote to the church at Ephesus, which is in Turkey, where he said, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. His point is, we're not wrestling against or contending with human opponents, even though we may see people of a different political party or a different lifestyle choice or a different skin color as the enemy. That's really not true. The true enemy of mankind, of all mankind, whether we realize it or not, it's not, us humans one against another. It's really these principalities, powers, thrones, dominions, cosmic rulers of this present darkness. Paul was talking about spiritual entities who have rebelled against the creator of the universe and who basically want to destroy humanity. And they're doing it by getting us to fight with each other. So Paul was trying to tell us, hey, look, spiritual warfare, guys, that's what this is about. It's against these principalities and powers. And it begins, for Christians, on our knees. It's hard because as humans, especially as men, we see a problem, we want to fix it. But we're operating in the natural realm, We've got our natural senses, we see a problem, we want to, and oftentimes that means fixing the person we disagree with. But that's not it. The enemy already wins if we already approach that other person with hatred. If we as Christians want to fulfill the one job Jesus gave us, which is to make disciples of all nations, we have to quit making ourselves a stumbling block between the people who don't know Jesus and him.
All right. Well, you kind of answered the second question too, but maybe we can go a little bit deeper into it. What specifically are the principalities and powers that Paul speaks about? Are they? You said they're spirit beings. Now, are they? If you can just expand on that a little bit, maybe.
The principalities and powers that Paul wrote about fall into a couple of different categories. I guess the easiest way to describe them would be fallen angels and demons. The difference between fallen angels and demons is a simple one. Fallen angels can manifest corporeally. We read in the Bible a number of times where angels interact with humans and do physical things. They eat a meal with Abraham. They eat a meal with Gideon. They fight with the citizens of Sodom and things like that. Angels can appear in physical form. They can actually do physical things too, because we read in Genesis chapter 6 about the angels who saw that the human women were fair and chose wives, or perhaps just took wives. Demons, on the other hand, are totally spirit. They need to inhabit a physical body in order to interact with us in the physical plane, they can oppress us, which can be a feeling of depression or dread, anxiety, stress. In the worst form, most intense form, demonic possession is when they actually overwhelm and take over a human. It's probably not as spectacular as what we see in the films, but there are cases where it does, having talked to deliverance ministers or exorcists, it sometimes gets that spectacular, that gruesome, that dangerous, that frightening. But those would be the powers, principalities, thrones, dominions. The way Paul writes about them, there's got to be some kind of a hierarchy there, because those are terms that could also be applied to human figures of authority. But in the context that he wrote, it's pretty clear he's talking about inhuman entities.
Absolutely.
Spiritual forces, cosmic forces. We normally don't perceive them as humans, and it's probably best that we don't. In fact, God made it pretty clear to Moses that he didn't want humans trying to contact the spirit realm. Do not consult mediums. Do not talk to necromancers, because we as humans are not prepared for the interaction. We see a being that is indescribably beautiful, a being of light, and we assume he's one of the good guys. But as Paul warned his readers, even Satan appears as an angel of light. The demonic realm, the spirit realm, they really don't have anything to gain by literally scaring the hell out of us. They would rather lull us into a false sense of security.
Amen, brother. Amazing. So are the 70 sons of God from the Deuteronomy 32 worldview the same gods worshipped worldwide from India to Peru?
Yes. And the interesting thing about that number 70 is that it doesn't necessarily refer to a specific actual number. Now, the Bible makes it clear that we were talking about the same ones, the gods of the nations, because in Genesis chapter 10, where we read about the sons, the descendants of Noah, the so-called Table of Nations, there are 70 listed there. But in the ancient Near East, not just with the Hebrew culture, but all across the ancient Near East, the Akkadians, the Amorites, everybody in the ancient Near East understood that 70 represented the complete set. In other words, not one left out. So, in fact, we see that number elsewhere in the Old Testament, like the 70 sons of Gideon who were slaughtered by, Abimelech. Even though Gideon, by the way, said, I don't want to be the king, I'll just make an ephod for myself and, stuff. But his son Abimelech, or, illegitimate son, his name means my father's the king. So, yeah, interesting. And he's the one, did Gideon really have 70 sons? It seems unlikely, but it means that all of them were killed except for the one survivor. So the number 70 means all of them. The Canaanites believed that their chief god, the creator god El, who his mount of assembly was Mount Hermon, which is the northern border of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria today, where the Watchers descended and made their pact to take human wives. He held court there with his 70 sons, the 70 sons of El. You go back a little further in history into about the time of Abraham, and there was a city in northern Syria by the name of Emar, not far from modern Aleppo, where scholars have dug up the clay tablets and found the records and all that. And there was an annual festival held in the spring where the people of Emar would sacrifice 70 lambs. This was usually done around the first day of the first month, the first of Nisan, about 2 weeks before the Hebrews would later celebrate Passover. They would sacrifice 70 lambs for Dagon, who was their chief god, who it was just El by a different name. Dagon and the 70 gods of the city, again representing all the other gods of the divine council, all the other gods other than the chief god, the king of the pantheon, Dagon. So you got the Canaanites believing there, the ancient Amorites of Emar with their 70 gods. The interesting thing about the 70 is that when God gave the feasts to Moses, let me back up, I'll save that for just a second. When God gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, but before he gave him the plans for the tabernacle, he did something interesting. He called Moses and said, okay, you and your brother Aaron, who was the high priest, Aaron's 2 sons, and the 70 elders of Israel, come up Mount Sinai. And so no one else was allowed near the mountain, because you touch the mountain and God would smite you. But Aaron, Moses, the 70 elders of Israel climbed the mountain, and this is in Exodus 24. They beheld the God of Israel, and he did not touch them. He did not harm them. They beheld the God of Israel and ate and drank. They had a meal up there on Mount Sinai, the 70 elders of Israel. Now, why did God do that? Because, now wait a minute, how is it possible? We're told that man cannot see the face of God and live. Well, this is where one of the examples in the Old Testament where we see the second power in heaven. We begin to get a picture of the Trinity in the Old Testament. Yes, God the Father in all his glory, when he passed by Moses, who was in the cleft of the rock, could not see his face because it's overwhelming. But God in the flesh, we see the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament in a number of places. That is God in a form that humans can perceive. And he called these men up his holy mountain and had a meal. It was a symbol of what was going to happen. It's a symbol of what's going to happen when we are finally restored to the divine council, when God finally brings us back into the divine council, which we got kicked out of when Adam and Eve disobeyed. But this was a message to the 70, meaning all the gods of the nations. This is what is in store for humanity. You're toast, and you're being replaced. It's like the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son. We will someday be welcomed back, covered with pig dung and smelling awful and looking horrible, and God will welcome us with open arms, and that is be the restoration of humanity to the divine council. His message to the 70 gods, again, representing all the gods of the nations. Now, here's the thing. The Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, I wanted to talk about this in my time today, and without getting another hour, I couldn't get into it. The spring festival, this ancient city of Emar, a pagan city, sacrificing 70 lambs in the spring, okay, around the time of the Passover, which is when Jesus was sacrificed, who John the Baptist called, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Okay? Jesus was the perfect lamb to sacrifice. The fall feast, which was the feast, as Rabbi Zev Parat talked about earlier today, the Feast of Tabernacles. When God gave that feast to Moses, he said, okay, here's the plan. It's a 7-day feast, a 7-day festival. On day 1, you sacrifice 13 bulls. Day 2, you sacrifice 12. Day 3, 11, etc. 7 days. Counting down by 1 each day, 70 bulls sacrificed. The bulls. In the ancient world, the bull imagery is connected to these pagan gods over and over again. El, chief god of the Canaanites, called Bull El. Kronos, chief god of the old gods of the Greeks, the Titans. His name comes from a Semitic word meaning horned one. And yet God, giving the feast to Moses, said, okay, here's what Passover, here's what the Feast of Tabernacles represents. Represents God delivering his people from all the other gods of the world, all the other gods of the nations. 70 bulls, the complete set, not one left out. They are sacrificed. God has delivered his people from the pagan gods, all the gods that God allotted to the nations of the world. And as Zeb pointed out, when Jesus came the first time, he was sacrificed as the lamb at Passover in the spring. When he comes back, it's Tabernacles time, where God delivers his people from the gods of the nations. It's beautiful.
That's amazing. It's just mind-blowing. How everything's so perfect and just kind of fits together like that is just,
I know.
Cold chills. All right. So it's like almost like you read this when I wasn't looking, because you're just going through my questions. Let me switch batteries before we dive in.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of what we think we know about Tammuz and Semiramis comes from Alexander Hislop and his book, The Two Babylons, which was written in the 1860s, if I remember correctly. And he meant well, but he had an axe to grind against the Roman Catholic Church. And there's a lot of research that's been done since the 1860s, a lot of texts that have been found that he did not know about, could not know about, because they were still underneath the sand in Iraq and Syria. Like the text from Ugarit, not found until 1928. Some of those not translated until the 1970s, 1980s. So a lot of what we know about that period of history, he was drawing from Herodotus, the Greek historian, whose audience was very open to stuff that made the Orientals, Persians, what was left of the Akkadians and so forth, Babylonians, look bad, because Herodotus was writing at about the time the Persians were, marching to try to destroy Greece. So you got to take what Herodotus wrote with a grain of salt. Semiramis was probably an Assyrian queen whose name was Shamu Ramat. She ruled as regent for a little while in the late 9th century BC, which would be about 811, 810 BC to about 800 BC. Now, Hislop taught that she was the wife of Nimrod. Nimrod was the king of Uruk. Now, Assyria is northern Iraq, around Mosul and Kirkuk, where the Kurds live. Uruk was down in southeastern Iraq. That's where the Sumerians lived. The Bible calls it Erech, E-R-E-C-H. Uruk, U-R-U-K, is what is how scholars transliterate the name. But today we still call it Iraq. Same name.
That's awesome.
5,000 years after Nimrod lived, it's the same name. But there's a period of history that scholars call the Uruk expansion, when that city in southeastern Iraq dominated the entire Fertile Crescent, as far north as southern Turkey. They controlled raw materials, trading posts. Basically, they dominated for almost 1,000 years all of the Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of southern Turkey. Well, Nimrod would have lived somewhere in that period when Uruk essentially dominated the known world. But about 3100 BC, 3000 BC, suddenly it all fell apart. It all fell apart, and scholars say, and I'm trying to piece this together now, I'm doing some study on this, and I'm not well schooled on this, so take this as tentative. But something happened around that period of history that caused a real disruption in society. Scholars know this and say, yeah, okay, for some reason, these settled cities and something, there was some disruption there, and everything just kind of went to pieces for a while. Well, okay, that kind of sounds like what happened after the Tower of Babel incident, where God confused the languages and suddenly there was a real reshuffling of the societies. Again, is there any smoking gun? No, there's not. But Nimrod, second generation king of Uruk after the flood, was in southeastern Iraq. Shemu Ramat, queen of Assyria, which is northern Iraq, quite a distance away, and about 2,000 years after Nimrod died. So Nimrod and Semiramis, wrong millennium, wrong nations. Tammuz was Dumuzi in the ancient Sumerian, and he was another king of Uruk in and around the time of Gilgamesh. I forget the order on the Sumerian king list, but according to the legend, he was married to the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, and he was a king of a city called Bad Tibera. And the way the story goes, demons wanted to drag Inanna's son, who was the patron god of this city, Bad Tibera, to the netherworld. And Inanna said, don't take him, take my husband instead. And so Dumuzi got dragged down to hell. And he became the first of the ancient Near Eastern dying and rising gods. Down in the netherworld for 6 months, then back in, corresponding with the cycle of vegetation. When everything turns brown, oh, Dumuzi's dead. This went on for a long time, obviously, because Ezekiel saw it, the people weeping for Dumuzi, in the temple. And this would have been in the 6th century BC, around 590, 580 BC, because Ezekiel had gone off with the first wave of refugees to Babylon. So, well, they're weeping for the god because the vegetation is dead. And so he's down in the netherworld, and so they're mourning the loss of the god as part of a ritual. And then in the spring, when things begin to green up again, then everybody celebrates, and perhaps fertility rites. I've not studied this a lot.
This took place at the Temple Mount.
Yeah, but there were other dying and rising gods around the ancient Near East. For example, Adonis to the Greeks, Melkart, who was a god of the city of Tyre around the time of Ahab and Jezebel, which makes the incident on Mount Carmel a lot more interesting, because Melkart, as one of the dying and rising gods, would be in the netherworld for half the year and above the ground for half the year. We know from a text found at the city of Tyre that there was a ritual performed similar to the drink offering, where you pour out water for the god. This is based on an older ritual amongst the Amorite peoples and the Mesopotamians, going back at least to about 3000 BC, or, well, at least 2000 BC, based on what I've read, where you have to pour out a drink offering and offer food to your dead ancestors, which you summon through a necromancy ritual. They had to do it every month on the 30th day of the month, when the night of no moon.
That's kind of a side point here. There is a ritual today where people will pour their drink out for their dead friends. Is that a continuation, you think?
It may well be. It may well be. In fact, in the ancient world, Mesopotamia was considered so important that the pourer of water was an epithet or a name, a way of describing your heir. Your heir, your oldest son, would take over the responsibility for performing this monthly ritual, which is called the kispum, Kispum. You would have to lay out, it's not like kids laying out, cookies and milk for Santa Claus on Christmas Eve. This was a ritual where you had 3 parts, where you had a communal meal where the family would get together and eat. Then you would have the calling of the name, where you call out the names of the ancestors, and you have the food sitting out for them, and then the pouring of water. And so the heir who took over this responsibility would be the pourer of water. If a couple was childless, they would adopt an heir as the pourer of water. In some cases, they would make inheriting the estate of the soon-to-be deceased contingent upon him performing the ritual, because in ancient Mesopotamia it was believed that if your descendants didn't perform the ritual correctly and set out the food and the drink, you were condemned to eat dust and clay for all eternity. Kind of like what God condemned Satan to when he kicked him out of Eden. You'll crawl on your belly eating dust and clay forever. Yeah. This is why Abraham was so freaked out. He was getting to an old age and he didn't have an heir. And here's an interesting thing. He said, Eleazar of Damascus is going to be my heir. Except that the word translated as Damascus, Ha Damasek, was probably wrong. According to a scholar I've read about this ritual, he said it was probably Ben Mesek, which means son of the cup. Son who pours out the water. Eleazar will have to be the son of the cup, and he's not even related to me. And then God gives him an heir, Isaac. But Abraham didn't know any better because the concept of Sheol and Abraham's bosom, all of that had not yet been revealed to the prophets. God was teaching Abraham where he was and taking him from there. Now, this hydrophory, this Yarid ritual was known even perhaps as far back as the time of the Watchers on Mount Hermon. A scholar named Edward Lipinski, very famous, they call him Orientalist, specialist in the ancient Near East, did a very important paper about El and the abode of El, the Canaanite creator god, Mount Hermon. The explorer Sir Charles Warren in 1869 climbed Mount Hermon. In September of 1869, he found that he found an ancient temple dated to the Greek period. So, after Alexander the Great conquered the Levant, a temple with a stone there. It was like 4 feet high, 18 inches wide, 12 inches thick, granite or limestone. And inscribed on it were the words in Greek, "Those who, by the order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here." Now, anyone who's studied Mount Hermon and the Watchers know who swore an oath on Mount Hermon. These angels who came down on Mount Hermon and said, well, 200 according to the Book of Enoch.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
But again, 70 is a representative number, meaning all the gods of the nations. But these 200 were condemned to Tartarus afterward. Those are the prisoners that Jesus proclaimed to in 1 Peter 3:19, when he was dead in the flesh but alive in spirit, went down and proclaimed to the prisoners.
The Mount Hermon transgressors? He went down there and was like, hey.
The way Dr. Michael Heiser puts it, he says, and I'm paraphrasing what Mike says, but it's like Jesus went down there and said, bet you didn't expect to see me here, but here's a newsflash. On the third day, I'm getting out of here, and you're still dead. So, the other thing that Sir Charles Warren found on the summit of Hermon is that the summit is scooped out, like it would have been basically excavated to receive these offerings, this Yarid, which is based on the same root as the name of the Jordan River. You remember that when you transliterate from Semitic or Hebrew to English, the Y becomes a J. It means to come down, to pour out. The Jordan River comes down from Hermon to the Sea of Galilee. So this ritual where you pour out this water may have been performed on the summit of Hermon. And what Edward Lipinski, the scholar, wrote was that Warren also found on the summit this low stone wall that forced you to circumambulate to the summit as you walk up to it, which is similar to the ritual that's been performed down to this day in Mecca, where you have to circumambulate the Kaaba with the Kaaba always on your left. Well, that's exactly how you had to. So Sir Charles Warren in 1869 asked the question, is the practice at the Kaaba, did it originate here? So, interesting. Now here's the other thing. We know, as I said, that this ritual was performed for the god of Tyre, Melkart, by one of the Roman emperors, I think 2nd century AD, which is long after the confrontation on Mount Carmel. But think about this. Melkart was the city god of Tyre, the Baal of Tyre, the lord of Tyre, at the time of Ahab and Jezebel, when Elijah confronted the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel. As part of this, he sent a servant down the mountain to get water from a river, to bring it up the mountain, like on Mount Hermon, and poured the water out on top of the. It wasn't to make it the wood harder to burn. It was to mock this ritual that had been done for this god, Melkart. God reversing the rituals of the pagan gods to make a mockery of them. And then, of course, he used the weapon of the chief god of the Phoenicians and the Canaanites and the Amorites to consume the sacrifice. We think of fire from heaven like a flamethrower. No, he was using a lightning bolt, which was the chief weapon of the storm god, Hadad, who's usually called Baal in the Bible. And here's the kicker. Melkart was just the Phoenician name of Hercules. So the priests.
Are you reading my questions? Keep going.
So the prophets of Baal who were destroyed on Mount Carmel may well have been priests of Hercules, who was one of the dying and rising gods, like Melkart. So the questions that Elijah was taunting his priests with make more sense. Oh, maybe he's sleeping. Oh, okay, maybe it's the wrong time of year and he's in the netherworld. He can't hear you. Or maybe he's on a journey. Remember the myth of Hercules, where he had to go perform these labors to redeem himself after killing his wife and children because Hera drove him mad. So maybe he's off, trying to collect, the golden fleece or whatever. I forget what the myth says, but it makes more sense when you understand what they knew back then that we have since forgotten because we don't have the worldview of the prophets and apostles.
Amazing. Amen. You said El was the chief god of the Canaanites?
Yeah, the creator god of the Canaanites.
Okay, so is there a connection in the Hebrew translations? El is translated as Lord God, correct?
Well, it depends. In some context, it
Like
probably does refer to, right.
Is God in the flesh, right?
El became the generic term for God in the Semitic world.
Okay.
In fact, it became so prominent that some scholars now are convinced that the name of the old god of the Sumerians, Enlil,
Okay.
which they used to believe was based on the Sumerian words En, which means Lord, and Lil, which means wind or ether or something. They're now believing that that's actually just a corruption of the Semitic Il Ilu, meaning God of gods. That, in other words, instead of being a Sumerian god, that Enlil, who was then replaced by Marduk in the Babylonian cosmology, which they just inherited from the Sumerians, more or less, was actually a Semitic god who was brought from the northwest, where we find Dagon, same god, different name, El, same god, different name, Kumarbi of the Hurrians and Hittites, same god, different name, Baal-Haman of the Phoenicians, same god, different name. Their points of origin all point to northern Syria or southern Turkey. Not far from the mountain where Baal, the storm god, was supposed to have built his temple, Mount Zephon. So this old god, this El or Il Ilu, god of gods, this old, I argue, is actually Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn of the Romans, king of the Titans, who, like the Watchers from Mount Hermon, was condemned to Tartarus. 2 Peter 2:4 says that the angels who sinned were thrust down to hell. That's how most English translations read. But the Greek word translated hell is actually Tartarau, which means Tartarus, thrust down to Tartarus. In the Greek mind, that's a different place from Hades. That's a special level of netherworld prison reserved for the old gods, the supernatural threats to the divine order.
Reading my questions. Seriously, this Tartarus hell is one of the things I wrote.
No, Tartarus is a separate level reserved for those. That is the abyss.
So a human dies without being saved. They go to hell.
Yeah.
An angel dies. They go to Tartarus.
Well, I don't know if they die per se. I don't know that they will actually die until they're thrown into the lake of fire, the second death. But yes, there is a special prison that's reserved for them.
Is that where Henry Gruver saw? Are you familiar with that story?
I'm not. I've met Henry a couple times, but I've not heard that story.
Apparently he was translated down there and saw them chant. Pretty amazing stuff.
Well, it's similar to what Enoch reported in the book of First Enoch with the flaming mountains in the netherworld.
7 mountains or something like that?
Yeah, the mountains in the netherworld that are burning, which relates to the stones of fire that God talked about in Ezekiel 28, the divine rebel from Eden who walked amongst the stones of fire.
Are they separate entities, or is that Lucifer disguising himself? Is Lucifer Baal, pretty much?
Well, I argue that Lucifer is Baal, and it's mainly because of the connections we see in the Bible. In Isaiah 14, Lucifer, which is really kind of a mistranslation. The Hebrew is Halel ben Shachar, which means light bringer, son of the dawn. Shachar was actually a deity in the Canaanite religion, dawn. But when Jerome translated the Bible into the Latin, the Vulgate translation, he used the Roman, or the Latin equivalent of light bringer, lux ferus, light bringer. And we English speakers have just sort of adopted that as a personal name, Lucifer. Well, again, it really just means light bringer. But Isaiah 14 says that what he was trying to do was to establish his mount of assembly in the heights of the north, the sides of the north, the uttermost north. There are a few English translations that actually get it right. This actually points back to the mountain that was sacred to the storm god, Baal. Or Hadad was his proper name. Baal just means Lord, which sort of became a proper name over time. But it was also considered sacred to the storm gods of the Hurrians, called Teshub, the storm god of the Hittites, called Tarhuns, the storm god of the Greeks, called Zeus, actually fought a major battle there against the god of chaos, Typhon, at Mount Zephon. Well, the phrase in Isaiah 14, translated sides of the north, heights of the north, uttermost north, Yarakate Zephon, is only used 3 times in the Bible. There, Psalm 48, where Mount Zephon was compared to Mount Zion, it's kind of some wordplay, actually. Har Zephon, Har Zion. But the only other place it's used is Ezekiel 38 and 39. You can tell I don't speak Hebrew. Ezekiel 38 and 39, and Ezekiel identifies that as the place from which Gog of Magog will bring his troops. You will come from the uttermost north. Yeah, you will come from Yarkate Zephon, Mount Zephon. Now, here's an interesting thing. Baal, the storm god, who was the chief god, the king of the gods, called a son of El in the Canaanite religion, but he became the king of the gods by defeating the god of death and defeating the god of the sea. Similar to the tension in Greek mythology, by the way, between the storm god Zeus, the god of the sea, Poseidon, and the god of death, Hades. In Canaanite religion, Baal had to defeat the god of death, Mot, and the god of the sea, called Yam, in order to become the king of the gods. The Greeks got their religion from the Canaanites. Well, Amorites, really, but... So anyway, that mountain, Mount Zephon, was so important to the Hebrews because it was so important to their neighbors in Canaan that Zephon became the word for the compass point north. In every other Semitic language from the ancient Near East, the word for north is Simal. But in Hebrew, it's Zephon. That's how important that was because of its relationship to that God. So, in the New Testament, Jesus, confronted by the Pharisees, says, oh, he's casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, which means Baal the prince. Baal the prince of demons, I guess. Jesus also, in Revelation 2, in the letter to the church at Pergamum, says, I know where you live. It's where Satan's seat. It's where Satan dwells. Satan's seat in Pergamum. Well, that was the great altar of Zeus, who, like Baal, was a storm god. So Satan to Jesus, and Jesus, by the way, in replying to the Pharisees, connected Beelzebul, Baal the prince, to Satan. So Jesus identified the storm god as Satan. Isaiah 14, storm god Lucifer. So yes, Lucifer is Baal, is Satan. It's all connected.
Amen.
Now, how do we figure out which gods and which cultures are the same from one to one? That, see, how does Shakespeare put it? That way madness lies. They lie. We don't know. I am under the opinion that the ancient goddess of sex and war, Ishtar, Inanna, kind of split off her personality by the time of the Bible, because to the Canaanites of Gilbert and the Canaanites who lived around, and by the way, for clarification, Canaanite is just a geographical designation like Babylonian. The Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi the Great was founded by Amorites. They were Amorites. The Canaanites who lived in Canaan, they were Amorites. It's like saying I'm a Chicagoite because I was born there. No, I'm German, Swedish, Welsh, English.
So the Amorites were the ones who lived directly, timeline speaking, it goes...
From about 2000, around the year 2000 BC, the Amorites somehow emerged from a period of chaos in the ancient Near East, which is what we would call today Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel. The Amorites came out with Amorite kingdoms in control of all of that. Everything from what is now Iraq to northern Egypt. In fact, when the Israelites were in Egypt, they weren't Egyptian kings. They were under the rule of Amorites. Amorite names. In fact, there was actually a pharaoh during that period whose name was Jacob. Yeah. Yaqub Har, Jacob of the mountain. They don't teach you that. And the gods that they worshipped were Semitic gods. Baal, Astarte, Ishtar, Resheph, the god of plagues and archers and chariot warriors, who, and I didn't even mention this today, is Apollo of the Greeks and Romans. The gatekeeper of the underworld. Oh yeah, Revelation 9. He's the king of those in the abyss. Opens and lets them out. It's all connected. So the Amorites had this belief. They were the ones who worshipped their ancestors. They were the ones who worshipped the Rephaim and some of them through necromancy rituals. And God, when he confirmed his covenant with Abraham, said your descendants are going to go to Egypt. They'll come back in what did he say, the fourth generation, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. He tied it to the iniquity of the Amorites. Guess what? The Amorites were also the forefathers of the Phoenicians, of the Arameans, who caused so much trouble after the time of David for Israel and for Judah. The Arabs. and the gods of the Amorites, who were still worshipped in Arabia into the Christian era, like the moon god, Sin, the war god, and this is what I was getting to with Ishtar and Astarte, split off a male aspect. So during the time of the judges, when Astarte, the goddess of sex, was worshipped, her male aspect, Athtar, the war god, was likewise worshipped. The gods of the Amorites continued to be worshipped in Arabia, and I argue in my forthcoming book that they formed a coalition that emerged from Arabia in the 7th century as a religion that will be the world's largest within the next 50 years.
Amazing. All right, well, you just answered another couple more of my questions over here. Is Zeus Lucifer? All right, so.
Yes, Zeus is Lucifer, and Thor.
That's amazing.
Which is sad because we really like the Thor movies,
well,
but when you're watching Thor on the screen, he's the storm god, which means, okay, well, it's Baal.
Yeah,
that's Satan.
It's about those Marvel movies. Yeah, I used to love those, but something, ever since I became Christian,
yeah.
It's just something inside of me is like...
And isn't it interesting the way Hollywood is beating this drum about the return of the Titans? Thanos, the Mad Titan, Sam Worthington, who was in Clash of the Titans and Wrath of the Titans, starred in a movie last year, went straight to Netflix called The Titan.
Yep.
Yeah, and the new Godzilla movie, where they have rebranded them. They're no longer Mutos, which is what, monsters of unusual size or whatever.
Yeah.
They rebranded them as the Titans, the original and rightful rulers of Earth.
And when I saw that trailer, I actually enjoyed the first Godzilla movie.
Oh, so did I.
I thought it was great. I was a manager at the theater at the time. And it was a great time. And when I saw the trailer for the next one, I was excited for like 10 seconds, and I was like, wait a minute, what are they trying to do here?
I'm wanting to watch it because I just love me a good monster movie. But yeah, it's also for the programming because, again, presenting them as Titans, the original and rightful rulers of the earth. The Titans are still around. In fact, I argue in my book, Last Clash of the Titans, that they are somehow still influencing things on this earth, even though they are currently chained in the abyss. Revelation 9 says they're going to get out for 5.5 months at the end.
When they come back, the Nephilim, spirits of the dead Nephilim, come back in the end times.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe they're going to be back in their physical bodies as giants, or their spirit bodies possessing humans through like Mark of the Beast technology?
When the Nephilim return, and we understand that the Nephilim, the spirits of the Nephilim that were destroyed in the days of Noah, in the flood, were barred entrance into the afterlife, into the netherworld, into heaven, basically condemned to roam the earth. That was the belief of the early church. That was the belief of the Jews in the time of Jesus and through all the Old Testament period. It wasn't until Augustine in about the 5th century that belief went away. He also basically turned the church away from believing that the Nephilim had been created at all. Ezekiel, though, saw it. And this is the thing. God bless people like L.A. Marzulli who've been, teaching this for a long time. He's right. The Nephilim are returning. Where I differ with L.A., and I've got to give him credit because without him and his book Nephilim, which was a novel that got me down this path, I wouldn't be here right now. But I think Ezekiel 39 is a clue, but you got to understand the worldview of the prophets to understand what Ezekiel was writing. In Ezekiel 39, he's writing about the culmination of the war of Gog and Magog, and Gog was the Old Testament Antichrist figure. Okay, he is the figure that John in the book of Revelation calls the Antichrist. That is the same war that culminates with the Battle of Armageddon, which is fought for the Har Moed, God's Mount of Assembly, which is Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Ezekiel says, God said that he will prepare a place in Israel for burial of Magog, the forces of Magog. The Valley of the Travelers east of the sea refers to east of the Dead Sea, and it will block the travelers. The key is understanding that travelers in the Old Testament concept, the Old Testament world, were spirits that would travel or cross over from one plane of existence to another. In other words, the realm of the dead to the land of the living. And the places where he identifies east of the Dead Sea are places that during the Exodus, the stations of the Exodus, refer to a couple of places that are named for these interactions with the spirit realm. One of the stops in the Exodus, one of the stations of the Exodus is called Ovoth, which means spirits of the dead. It's based on a root word Ov, which means medium. The medium of Endor that Saul went to see was the Ov of Endor. In fact, one of the giants killed by David's men, Ishbi, they condense the word. Ishbi Benab is how it looks to us in English. Ishbi Ben Ov. Ishbi, son of the necromancer, son of the medium. And he was of the descendants of the Rapha, the sons of the Rephaim. The Rephaim were these spirits that the Amorites, the Canaanites, believed were the spirits of the mighty men who were of old, the ancestors of their kings. They were called in Canaanite texts, called by scholars the Rephaim texts, written about the time of the judges, where these Rephaim were summoned through necromancy rituals to the tabernacle of El, Mount Hermon, where El, they believed, would speak words of revivification to resurrect these spirits that were called warriors of Baal. And in these texts, they're described as warriors. They mount their chariots and they travel first one day and then another. And at dawn of the third day, they arrive to be resurrected. Like Jesus, who went down and preached and proclaimed to the spirits in prison until dawn of the third day, when he arrived, except that he really was resurrected. And Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 39, says, this is where these travelers will be buried. Another one of the stops on in fact, the mountain where Moses was led by God to get his only view of the Holy Land, the Promised Land. Climb this mountain of the Avarim. In Hebrew, that means travelers. Mount Nebo is the mountain of the travelers. It's right there across from Jericho in the plains of Moab. And that's where this demonic army will fall. Now, I believe that the Nephilim will return. I believe they're going to be the demons who possess a human army. I think by this point the restrainer will have been removed. The church will be removed. So I pray I'm right, that we won't be here for that day, because that's the day of Armageddon. And when this demonic army comes against Jerusalem to try to claim God's Mount of Assembly, just like Lucifer in Isaiah 14, I will establish my Mount of Assembly on Mount Zaphon, raise himself above the stars, the angels of God. On that day, when God personally takes the battlefield, which Ezekiel describes, the travelers will be destroyed. And interestingly, in that verse in Ezekiel 39, he says, then the world will know I am the Holy One in Israel. That phrase is similar to one that we see in the Old Testament many times. The Holy One of Israel. Ezekiel 39, after he destroys the Antichrist army in the Battle of Armageddon that ends the war of Gog and Magog, he becomes the Holy One in Israel because he's on the battlefield. So yes, that is when, the Nephilim have always been here. If they're the spirits of those who died in the flood 6,000 years ago, they've always been with us, because demons have always been with us. But on that day, they will be inhabiting the bodies of I believe, this army that comes against Israel. It will literally be an army of the evil dead. Like the ultimate zombie apocalypse. God puts a stop to it. And what does it mean when Ezekiel writes in Ezekiel 39:11, it will block the travelers? The word translated block is only used one other place in the Bible. It's in Deuteronomy, the verse that talks about thou shalt not muzzle an ox when he treads out the grain. Muzzle. I'm not quite sure what that means, but if we take it in context of what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, that we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed, we will be resurrected. Maybe that's what God is saying. I will block the travelers. They're dead and they are staying dead when the rest of us are resurrected into new glorified bodies.